Now we're going to delve into the how to finance this project and also financial concerns regarding the public-private partnership development. And so our moderator today is David Dodd. And before I go into the particular introduction, I just want to say, and this is kind of a 20,000 foot view, but my oversimplification often works when we're talking about how to obtain private aspects of finance for global trade and international trade contributing projects. And that is when a government needs to bridge a financing gap between available public funds and the funds requisite to complete the project, the private sector is an ideal location to look. And so what the P3 financing model gives us, and as our panel will probably talk much about today, is the fact that at its most simple form, global efforts face constraints on public resources, and there is a fiscal space there regarding finance availability that is lacking, and there's a move here. There's a move afoot for investment in infrastructure, and we're not just talking about places that have been devastated from a natural disaster or storm or the like, but places that require infrastructure and development on the front end. And so I think that that'll be very interesting. Our panel moderator began his career as a commercial banker in development finance and has since spanned a career of economic development, workforce development, influence on public-private partnerships, site location consulting, international trade and technology transfer. David's the president of the International Public-Private Partnership and Resilience Center and also DADCO, which teaches innovations in economic development. And so I'll now turn the panel over to our moderator and thank everyone very much for participating.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It's a real pleasure to be here today, especially with this esteemed group of people. We had breakfast this morning, and if you notice, we were all a few minutes late getting here because we couldn't stop the conversation. So hopefully that's going to carry over into this panel, and it will be a really productive session. My background is in economic development. Started out in banking and then went into economic development. And economic development has been defined as public-private partnerships that create widespread private investment and jobs. And I couldn't agree more with that. So we're going to deal with that. We're going to deal with also more traditional public-private partnerships such as infrastructure projects. That's what most people think about when they think about PPPs. But Tommy Clark called me out and about this Supply Chain Transportation Council. I also do recovery work under contract with the Economic Development Administration, Department of Commerce, and we were doing recovery from the floods in Louisiana, and we came up with the idea to pull the public and private sector together to collaborate on making the transportation system in Louisiana more resilient. That's a public-private partnership. Now you say, well, that's a programmatic partnership. That doesn't require financing. Well, so happens the members of the council had the legislature pass a concurrent resolution recognizing the council as an advisory group to the legislature on issues of resilience in supply chain and transportation system of the state, and also asked that they produce a report on vulnerabilities in transportation in February of 2018. So guess what? This programmatic effort needs some financing. So what we're actively trying to do now is put together a public-private partnership utilizing potential grant funding from EDA and some private foundation funding. And nonprofit and philanthropic funding is also important in the mix. So please keep that in mind. And with that, I'm not as sophisticated as David. David had a tablet. I just have a phone. I want to introduce the panelists. And I'm just going to introduce them, their name and title. I asked them to introduce themselves because that way I'm not fumbling trying to decide what to say. They know what to say about their relevant experience. First is Chris Kane. He's a partner with Adams and Reese in litigation here in New Orleans. Second to him is Jake Vlok, who is Director of Project and Export Finance for Siemens Financial Services. And next to Jake is Carolyn Lee. She's a partner with EB5 Immigration Group of Miller Mayer attorneys, law firm. And then Antti Suhonen, who is the Executive Director of JP Morgan Securities, LLP. So with that, I'm going to hand this to you, Chris, and if you would just say a few words about your background and then hand it over to Jake. Thank you.
Thank you. The last panel really, I think, set us up pretty well because I think 3 of the 4, the things that kept them up at night were, it sounded like lawyers. So we've got 2 on this panel. By quick way of background, my bio mentioned litigation, and I do litigation, but quick background. As a result of Hurricane Katrina, really, litigation in New Orleans had shut down for a good bit of time, at least the work I was working on, and I partnered up with one of our law partners at the time, Ray Cornelius, who's since passed away, who was kind of an economic development guru here in Louisiana, and just sat in his back pocket for a few years and learned a lot about economic development, public finance, and as a result of that, began doing a lot of work with P3s, with clients relative to port jurisdictions, public transportation, and logistics. And as a result of that, that's kind of how my background is relevant to today's discussion.
I'm with Siemens Financial Services in Houston, Texas. Siemens Financial Services is a wholly owned subsidiary of Siemens. We have about, last number I saw, 2016, about $30 billion of debt and equity investments in projects all over the world. The group that I'm part of in Siemens Financial Services is a group called Project and Export Finance, and we look exclusively at projects in which Siemens equipment is used. It's not an equipment financing a product. We live in a world of project finance, and we've got a particular interest in P3 projects. I think, sort of listening to the discussions this morning, one of the other plus points that P3 has going for it is that in the project finance market, there's a lot of liquidity in the market, and that liquidity is looking for deals. P3 is an emerging market. There's clearly a lot of upside and a lot of potential. Let me see. Prior to being on the equipment vendor side, I spent most of my career as an investment banker in New York City, and I started my career in South Africa, also in investment banking and commercial banking, and really that's where I started working on P3.
Let's see if this one works. Hi, my name is Carolyn Lee, and I'm an attorney, an immigration attorney, specializing in EB5 investment visas. And that's the space that I've been in for about the last 14 years or so. And I've been really lucky to be a part of really a movement in immigration and in structuring finance that's been able to use immigrant investor capital to supplement the capital stack, or in some instances be exclusively the capital source for U.S. development projects. My firm has been pretty successful in this space. We've helped our clients raise about $2.5 billion in EB5 Capital, and we've filed thousands of investor petitions. I think the latest number is about 5,500. So again, I feel very fortunate to have a lot of experience in this area that's really an intersection of capital and immigration. And it's been exciting listening to the prior panel because I'm seeing more and more of those intersections that are possible between EB5 Capital and P3 projects, because EB5 is inherently about job creation. That is a required element of an EB5 project. And promoting economic growth is also a requirement of EB5 regional centers that are typically the hub, the organizers of EB5 projects. And I think the fact that there's so much emphasis on accountability on the part of public officials managing P3 projects, and of course the private sector part of the partnership will be interested in making sure that the project succeeds and is viable from a more straightforward economic standpoint. Those things, and then you bring into it the fact that from an investor standpoint, the fact that a P3 project is going to have been underwritten by a government entity and will have participation from perhaps some institutional players that the foreign investor market will have some familiarity with. These are all very positive traits that I think would work very well as an EB5 project. So I think the opportunity is there for EB5 to play more of a role in this emerging market, as Jake is calling P3.
Very good. Again, my name is Antti Suhonen, and I'm with JP Morgan's Public Finance Infrastructure Group. So in my day-to-day job, I provide investment banking services to local municipalities and state-level authorities and state governments in kind of Rocky Mountain and Midwest regions, with a focus on transportation infrastructure and toll roads. In Louisiana, I've worked on several transactions with the state, DOTD, as well as with Baton Rouge and some of their sewerage infrastructure projects. So I in my day-to-day job, see firsthand the decision-making process when projects are evaluated, whether or not they're worthwhile projects in and of itself, and then how do we approach the kind of financing and procurement of this project. And that's where usually the decision, that is the decision point for, do we go to a traditional route and issue municipal bonds, or do we look at other alternative financing mechanisms such as P3s?
Great, thank you all very much. As you can see, they have a world of experience and different areas of experience. And what I'd like to do is start more at the global level and then work our way down to issues specific to Louisiana. And one of the things that is very, very important in looking at structuring financing is what type of P3 is it? There are different types. There's design, build, operate. There's simply operate. There's build and operate. And I'd like for the panelists to just give us their take on the pros and the cons and maybe some of the risks inherent in those different structures, and then maybe give an example of one or more P3s that they've worked on, one that was successful and maybe one that they don't have to name it that was not successful. I worked on one for 4 years in Mexico that never came to fruition. And that's the most disappointing thing. I'd almost rather it come to fruition and then fail. At least we could say we tried. It was building a huge megaport to compete with, really not compete with, to take some of the pressure off of Los Angeles and Long Beach that were just completely straining it over capacity. And in the middle of that, there was an announcement that the Panama Canal was going to widen itself. Which kind of put that on the back burner. So that's my example of a non-successful P3. And that was going to be a design, build, operate by Hutchison Whampoa, the huge port operator, and did not come to fruition. But the structuring is really important. So if each of you could address that, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. Well, I'll start off with, one of the things I thought the panel earlier did an excellent job of framing the definition of P3, because I think in this field there's a lot of discussion about, well, what is really a P3, and this isn't a knock on the political side or the government side of it, but a lot of times administrations want to call things P3s that they simply are not really P3s. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is a true P3 is, let's start with the third P in the P3, partnership. That means that the public component has to really be putting in not just an asset or money, but there's got to be an assumed risk with it. And on the private side, obviously, there is a specialty, an area of financing, whatever it might be, that they come into play. And I thought the first panel really did a great job of outlining that. But from that definitional standpoint, from my perspective, really the two types of P3s that I've worked on, one being asset-based, meaning what the public put into the project is actually real estate, not money, but real estate, and leveraged up the real estate. And another project was more of a programmatic project, public transportation project. Both of which have been fairly successful. Those two examples, we'll talk about them probably later on when we get more local, because they are local. But the projects that I have been involved with, where you tend to see, I think, challenges, and again, we go into the discussion from the last panel about concerns of over-lawyering, or you sit down with a term sheet, and at the end of the day, the document, the agreement looks nothing like the term sheet. And a lot of times that's because of the physical public dollars that goes into a project and the various requirements, whether it be state or municipal, depending who's participating, in what you can do with those funds and how you define those. Most of the states in which I've worked in on P3s has a pretty clear linear test on how you can use public dollars in terms of an investment in a P3. Here in Louisiana, we've got a good Louisiana Supreme Court case that gives us a bright line basis, the Cabela case from 2006, and that removes some of those challenges, or it should. But the risk side of it, and the reason why you see a P3 perhaps fail, is the concern on the political piece. Are we giving up cash, and is the public behind me going to be upset with me as the public official for not being a steward of that money, or to question us in terms of how we are defining what the rate of return is to the public benefit? And that test right there, the challenge on the political side, can take a long time sometimes. And that, to me, is the biggest issue in your project. It probably took a year too long, because if it happened a year earlier, the Panama Canal wouldn't have been announced and you would have had a port. So that's kind of the challenge that I see in the different types of P3 models that have been successful and/or can create some challenges.
Yeah, I want to add to one of the points that Chris made up front, and it is this issue of definition. P3 means a lot of things to a lot of different things to a lot of different people. One of the things that I've encountered over time is that P3 brings up in people's minds the concept of privatization, and that can often people can have nightmare connotations to it, for various political and economic reasons. The other thing is also that P3 is not a magic bullet, and by definition, P3 is not always the best option. I think Antti referred to that point as well, that one really has to analyze all the alternatives. What if you don't do the P3, or what if you do something else than the P3? And you really have to look at it at all the benefits over time. The reality is that most P3 projects, at least that I've been involved in, we started so early on in the process that, and the situation is typically the following. There's an old project finance joke that goes something like, the question is it a good project? Meaning, is it a project that can be financed? And then the answer is typically, well, there's no site, there's no permitting yet, there's no construction contract yet, the business plan isn't really well defined, and there's no debt and equity to finance it. But other than that, it's a beautiful project. So that's sort of, and so I think a big part of evaluating whether one would even embark on a P3 initiative or P3 project comes down to really early on getting all the stakeholders involved, and the need to have professional advisors covering technical, legal, financial, environmental, all of those things even if a P3 project makes sense and you get halfway or three-quarter or anywhere along, and there's fatal flaws regarding environmental or legal or regulatory issues, it creates big problems. I would say from my experience, the P3 projects that's been the best ones, that's the nicest ones, is the typical model where the authority, the muni, contributes an asset, an existing asset, into the project SPV. That asset could typically be very run down. It might run at 20% availability. Maintenance on the project on the asset has been deferred for many, many years, and it's just going downhill. And in that case, what a P3 can do is to mobilize private sector financing, and over time, you would then see the benefits in having a proper OPEX and CAPEX maintenance regime for the asset. The private sector would be a private sector operator or sponsor company would be responsible for that. They would carry that risk, and that is sort of the traditional, most optimal situation where you can see the clearest benefits compared to, say, assets where there isn't necessarily such a big maintenance need. And then I think within that, you can see it on a BOO or a BOT basis, so a build, own, operate, or a build, own, operate, and transfer model. We'll probably talk some more about that. It really ultimately gets very fact and situation specific, project specific, and clearly what the authority and agency wants and needs.
So EB5 would come in as a slice of capital in the capital stack for a project, whether it's P3 or not P3. It has to come through a vehicle that is specially formed for the purpose of collecting and pooling EB5 capital. And this pooling vehicle has a name. It's called a new commercial enterprise. And the immigrant investors are buying equity interests in that new commercial enterprise. And then the new commercial enterprise would make an investment into a P3 SPV or a private developer that is participating in a P3, and perhaps, there are examples where the new commercial enterprise makes an investment into a government entity for a particular project. And all of the criteria that Jake mentioned that would define a good project would define a good EB5 project. USCIS requires proof that this project is going to be feasible from a job creation standpoint. There will be enough jobs, 10 jobs per every investor, created within a relatively short time for a P3 time span. The time span for EB5 job creation is 2.5 years from the time an immigrant completes the first stage of their immigration process. So that's how EB5 would come in on the P3 financing side. It would be channeled through a new commercial enterprise, and typically the new commercial enterprise would make a loan into a particular other entity, whether an SPV or a developer entity. To David's point, just to give you some examples of EB5 capital in some public projects, and I'm not going to promise that they will meet the pure definition of a P3 project that Chris has outlined, but there are public and private components, and EB5 has come into these projects, and a number of them are port projects. One involves a number of EB5 projects in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And there the municipal involvement was rather extensive because the borrower in those projects was the Brooklyn Navy Yard Development Corporation, which is a quasi-government entity. And that entity was the borrower of EB5 Capital, and the Brooklyn Navy Yard is also government-owned land. And there have been a series of projects involving EB5 Capital that built out various uses on the Brooklyn Navy Yard for light manufacturing, studios, movie and television studios, and retail and other wonderful uses that have really revitalized a Navy yard that had been not used for decades. Similarly, EB5 Capital, about $250 million of it was used in San Francisco in the Hunters Bay shipyard facilities that was developed by Lennar Corporation. And this is public information. That project had been flagging for a very long time. And EB5 Capital came in and contributed to infrastructure development, and that was the first phase of it, and then to developing vertically various parcels within Hunters Point Shipyard. And that the EB5 Capital really jump-started that project, and it's been very successful. It is now, I think, on the 7th or 8th series of raising EB5 Capital for that asset. There have been EB5 Capital projects involving bond purchases. There was one used in the JFK airport, another in the Hawaii airport. So there are many examples where EB5 has come in projects that have a public dimension, and they've done very well in the EB5 marketplace because of the reasons I mentioned. Investors, overseas investors, especially Chinese investors that have been such a huge part of the EB5 investor market, have really been attracted to projects with a public component because they think it's safer, and they like that there's been government participation in the project and government underwriting.
I always personally like to kind of reverse engineer things to better understand them. And the question is really is like, why are we all talking about P3s? Because if DOTD had, got a gas tax increase through and it was flush with cash and all the governmental entities had all the money that they need for their infrastructure, we wouldn't be talking about this topic. Because everyone would be just either funding things on a pay-as-you-go basis or issuing tax-exempt municipal bonds. Louisiana has billions and billions of dollars of transportation infrastructure-related projects in a backlog, but yet no funding identified for that. And that's where the conversation about P3 comes to play. But unfortunately, again, P3 is not the pot of gold in the end of the rainbow. It's like it's not free money, it's not found money, but what it is that it's the ability to put together different funding sources. So oftentimes the financing structures for the P3 programs, rather than just relying on some kind of a governmental revenue stream or contributions, they include loans from TIFIA, which is a federal program that provides for subsidized loans that, in addition to being subsidized, are extremely flexible, that can be structured to accommodate a project that may not be generating revenue in the first 5 years. Often they include private activity bonds. In Louisiana, there's, I think, about $1.7 billion of unused private activity bond capacity. And those bonds are instruments that can be issued toward private projects on a tax-exempt basis. So it provides essentially a subsidized financing cost for a project. And then they include public contributions for governmental entities. And last, but definitely not least, the equity component. Equity is the patient investor. Equity investor may be investing in a project with the idea that, hey, I may not get a return in the next 10 years, but I'm willing to do that because I get over the life of the projects, the return is acceptable to me. And that differentiates the P3 financing model from the traditional municipal model in that now you got money that's willing to wait. Versus if you issue bonds, you can capitalize some interest cost and the first 3 years, and so you can take that those interest payments and pay for them from capitalized funds. But equity capital truly allows projects that otherwise wouldn't take place to take place. Now you still need a repayment source, and so in today's market, the P3 projects that we're seeing are kind of divided into two different categories. There's the revenue generating that are typically toll roads or some kind of a user charge. And then there are the ones that are called availability payments, which is typically just a government appropriation. One unsuccessful and one successful P3 project, State Highway 130 around Austin in Texas, went to bankruptcy recently. and the loans got then restructured, and part of the reason for that was that their traffic forecast, it's a tollway, and their traffic forecasts were overly aggressive. And when I say unsuccessful, I qualify that because unsuccessful to who? Well, to those investors who initially invested, for sure, because they lost money. But the public got a piece of infrastructure. There was never disruption in terms of that road being open to public. So that goes back to, I think Chris mentioned and David mentioned, the risk-sharing component of it is that, the risk-sharing kind of changes the paradigm, that even if a project that's financially maybe not successful, but that risk is now borne by or carried by the private sector, and the public still gets the infrastructure ahead of schedule. And another successful one in Colorado, they built managed lanes between Denver and Boulder on a P3 basis to accelerate the project delivery. Some estimates said that if it hadn't not been done on a P3 basis, the project would have been probably 10 years away in terms of what the regional funds available were. So that's another key element, that maybe you don't get all the cost savings, but it may allow, with the equity contributions and this kind of a more innovative finance structure and more innovative project delivery structure, to accelerate projects to address regional and statewide transportation needs.
Not that I'm not loud enough. I taught economic development for about 23 years at the Economic Development Institute at the University of Oklahoma, and I was constantly told I did not need a mic when I was in a smaller room. Gave great examples of what makes a P3 project of success and failure. Certainly there are people in the audience that might be thinking, oh, I wonder, how can I put together a proposal for a P3 project? And what would these people look for as legal counsel, as investors in particular? What would you guys look for? What are the things, what are the triggers for you when you look at something that comes across your desk? Antti is a funder, or Carolyn is a representative of EB5 investors. What are the specific things when you look at P3s? And again, not just transportation. We tend to think of P3s and transportation, but the first discussion Carolyn and I had was about economic development projects. What are those 2 or 3 things that either you put a check mark or you raise a red flag? I think that would be a useful thing for people in the audience to know. What 2 or 3 things you see it and you check it off and say, yes, this is going in the right direction? Or what are the things that you see and you go, wait a minute? Because Antti gave a great example of that. They had these projections for this loop around Austin. I know the highway, and they were overly aggressive. So what are those things? Just if you could just think about that and give us a couple of things.
Well, this is a fun question to answer, really, because from my standpoint, a lot of times the role of the lawyer, if you're representing the private sector, is you get somebody on the phone or in your office, ask a question: can we do X, Y, and Z? Is it legal to do this? And to the point earlier, I reverse engineer the question. This is a Ray Cornelius school of thought. I don't want to first figure out legally what can be done, because I need to first understand, what do you want to do? What is it do you want to accomplish? And let's talk about the different ways you might be able to do that. And usually it comes down to, there's a lot of times clients on my end there's a gap of financing need in order to make a project work, or there is real estate that is being held by a public entity that is critical to the project. And so the first thing I do is ask that question. And then what you really, I think the litmus test, and I think that's kind of where you're going from my standpoint of encouraging a client to move forward in a P3 discussion, is what is the benefit that the public is going to get out of this project, and what is your need? And you balance those two, because if this isn't a leprechaun with a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, and making clients understand that there's a lot of good folks in our industry who market that there's a bunch of free money in the world. If it was, we wouldn't be sitting here right now. That's not how these projects work, right? So making sure they understand that and figuring out what that gap need is and measuring it to what the benefit's going to be in return to the public is, I think, the key, the key litmus test, and also the red flag. If that's out of balance, then we need to restart and rethink it. The other component to another concern, I would say, in terms of the red flag is who is the public part of the public-private partnership? There's a lot of entities who, particularly recently, are getting involved in P3s. That expertise and experience that is either there or not there is important to know. That's a due diligence component, meaning has this entity evaluated doing P3s? What is their sophistication? Because that's going to be a cost component to your client. We may need to teach them. And there's examples of that I'm sure we've all been involved with, teaching the public entity what they can do and convincing them of that. But also the political side of it. And this is just a reality in all of these projects. Who is making the decisions? Is it a commissioner board? Is it going to go to the Joint Committee of Transportation? Does it vote from two chairmen, or is it something that needs to go in front of the LTA? Whatever all these different entities, knowing that roadmap up front and understanding it and getting a grasp of your political realities is, from my perspective, from the lawyer's perspective, an important first step due diligence component of any of these projects.
Yeah, if I look at any project which is a standalone project, which is ring-fenced in a project company, a special purpose vehicle, the ability of that special purpose vehicle, of the project, of the P3, to attract long-term debt financing, to be able to do that, you really have to get into all of the things that make the project work or not. I mean, is the sponsor in the project, is the consortium or the sponsor, is it a credible sponsor with track record in operating whatever the P3 is? What about the maintenance on the project? If it is not the sponsor itself, is there a reputable party? What about the EPC, the construction company that has to construct the asset? On the flip side, somebody referred to the availability model. Will the project have sufficient revenues to pay for all these expenses and be able to service the project debt, wherever it's sourced from, to service the project debt, and then at the bottom to provide an acceptable return to the equity? So I think that's sort of always the analysis that I go through. You like to try and put as much debt within reason in the project. I've only seen once where debt was not part of the P3, and where the sponsor, the private sector sponsor / operator that came into the deal funded the entire P3 on an all-equity basis. And they could do that for a number of reasons. It was a small deal. It was, I mean, I forget the exact number, $50 or $60 million. And they were big enough to be able to do that with an idea that after they reached financial close, they then went into the debt market and put debt into the SPV. But those are, at least in my experience, few and far between. So I think it's really from the ground up. Is it a project that can be financed? And for the project to be financed, you have to really due diligence and make sure that all of these various components that make up a successful project is managed and has professional people with track record that will take responsibility for the execution and completion and for bearing the risk over the project lifetime.
Well, again, I'm struck by the similarities in the kind of due diligence that we would do representing an investor, or when we're advising a client, a project client, helping that client put that project together from an EB5 immigration compliance standpoint. The first and foremost is job creation within the required time period, which is an odd thing because it's ultimately not tested until many more years down the road, and that has to do with the complexity of the immigration process for the immigrant investors. It's a 3-stage process, and for Chinese investors, this process spans right now from to about 13 to 15 years. But at the outset, the job creation is tested, meaning it has to be shown to be there, to be completed for an investor within a roughly 2.5-year window. So the job creation is projected, is measured using an econometric model, an input-output model that the U.S. government recognizes, like RIMS-2 or IMPLAN. And these models are run based on projected, typically, expenditures, construction expenditures that are projected to occur based on the construction budget for a particular project. So the model's got to show that within the required window, there will be enough job creation for all of the investors projected in a particular project. So if you have 100 million raised, that's going to be 200 investors, and that's going to require 2,000 jobs. So your model's got to spit out at least 2,000 based on the projected expenditures. So that's the first thing you look at. And that's very straightforward and objective and is numbers based. But then you need to look at, well, what are those inputs based on? Do they look credible? And my test is looking at it from that, if you will, an unsophisticated standpoint as compared with a kind of analysis that Jake would do or Antti would do, because I'm an immigration lawyer. I'm looking at this from the standpoint of how a USCIS examiner would test the feasibility of this project. But you look at very much of the same things. Who is the developer here? What's their track record? Have they done similar projects like this? Another key component that USCIS looks for, and therefore what I look for, and goes to feasibility, is how is this project capitalized? What are the other sources? And USCIS looks to make sure that those sources are in place. The test is, are all of the other sources of capital committed? That doesn't mean always that you've got, if there's a senior loan involved, that you've closed on that, because there are often conditions imposed, as I understand it, before that loan can close, and sometimes the conditions are EB5 Capital or some of it being in place. But there has to be, to my mind, in the diligence that I do, the sense that this loan is going to close within the span of time where I would expect USCIS to ask for it. So right now, based on my experience, from the time of filing of that project, it might be between 5 to 6 to 7 months. So I need to ask the client, the project client, or if I'm representing the investor, I need to ask the project folks, when are you expecting to close on this loan, because we're going to be asked for a signed document within a 6 to 8 month window. And if they're not going to get there, then that's a risk that that project has from an EB5 standpoint. Job creation, feasibility, other sources of capital in place, credibility of the sponsor, the developer. There's always a regional center involved in these EB5 projects in the way that we're talking about, in the scale that we're talking about for P3. They're not required, but they often are, because for any EB5 project of scale, it's going to have to be a regional center project and not what's called a basic project. Regional center projects are going to involve an entity that's been designated as a regional center by USCIS. They have gone through the process of applying for it. And so part of the diligence is also looking at the regional center, their track record, whether or not they've been compliant with USCIS requirements for maintaining the designation. And those requirements are getting much more stringent and fluid. They're evolving. So that's something that we need to look at as well. Has the regional center, how long has it been around? How many deals have they done? Have they taken investors through that lengthy process from beginning to end already? Have they repaid capital? Have they made their annual 924A certification filings? So that's another layer of diligence involved on the EB5 side of things.
I echo everything that's been said so far. It's the credibility of the team, the credibility of the entity sponsoring the P3. Does the project work? And all of those factors are important to kind of determining whether the transaction goes forward. On the more kind of mechanistic or logistical side is that oftentimes entities hire a financial advisor, or they have a financial advisor who's qualified and experienced in the process, and they may consult with other entities who have gone through the process, and they draft usually first an RFQ, and to which folks can respond to, and oftentimes folks can even solicit comments on the project and the project parameters, so that the entity sponsoring the P3 can learn also what the private sector thinks about the project and what needs to potentially change in order to get that project going. And then following that RFQ process, there's usually a more formal RFP process that then includes whether if it's a pure kind of a revenue generating project, so maybe it's their bid price in terms of what they estimate the total cost of the project to be, and what share of the project revenues they want in order to be able to build that get that project off the ground. But that's the kind of RFQ, RFP process, and all those factors that were discussed really matter. And ultimately, it's where is the funding coming from? Is that there has to be either a source of revenues or some kind of a pledge from an entity who's willing to pay for it. Is that that once you identify the funding, then we can figure out like how much financing does that funding support. And those are the kind of two elements that they decide really is that can this project happen? And maybe it is that there's a gap. There was an analysis done for a bypass around Baton Rouge. I think I want to say it was HNTB, but don't quote me on that. I may be wrong. That analyzed that there was a certain percentage of the cost of building that bypass roads around Baton Rouge that could be supported with toll revenues. And there was a funding gap essentially that DOTD or whoever wanted to sponsor the project, if they wanted to see the project happen, would have to come from public funds. So it doesn't have to be one or the other, and that's the beauty, I think, of the P3 approach, is that you can pool, like I mentioned, federal loans, private activity bonds, local, regional government contributions. You can pool all these funding sources to potentially make something happen that otherwise wouldn't get off the ground.
Right, and you made a perfect segue for me, Antti, talking about the possibility of a toll road expressway around Baton Rouge. And I love Baton Rouge. Anyone from Baton Rouge in here, don't get me wrong, but after driving from South Baton Rouge to downtown for 19 months every day, I would gladly pay $20 a day, $20 a toll to have an expressway around Baton Rouge. But that brings us down to Louisiana, and just a side note, David Baxter and his panel mentioned resilience in P3s and what the importance of that. And I happen to have just launched a center that's affiliated with the United Nations, based here in New Orleans, that will dwell on that subject, resilience in P3s. So I looking at that and saying, how do you convince the public sector the private sector, that it's worth their while to invest in resilient infrastructure? And we're working now through the Economic Development Administration, Department of Commerce, and FEMA with a group called REMI, which is another financial analysis, input-output financial multiplier model, to develop a return on investment model for resilience. And what it says is if you can reduce loss by X amount, and there's Y chance that an event's going to occur within the next 20, 30 years, that the reduction in loss equates to a positive return. And that's hopefully something that can be used in Louisiana and the rest of the nation and the rest of the world. But I wanted to and Chris is from here, and Jake and Antti have both worked here, and Carolyn knows there's, I think there are 5 regional centers, I think 2 or 3 that are active in Louisiana. So this can apply to all of you, but let's drill down to Louisiana. And is there any specific, Mr. Attorney, enabling legislation that can help with structuring and delivery of P3s in Louisiana?
Well, this is an exciting question you gave me. I'm joking. I'm being sarcastic. Well, starting from the beginning point, in Louisiana, if you're not from here and have just picked up pretty much any newspaper, you understand what our problem is. We don't have any money. So that's an interesting starting point as a partner to come to you and say, we ain't got no money. Can we partner? Having said that, what we do have in Louisiana is, and it's not completely inconsistent with what we see in other states and jurisdictions, we do have enabling statutes. We talked earlier about specifically the DOTD P3 component, and that's important because now that allows for a solicitation process to go through a quicker stream for LDOTD to get projects moving, and that's the Bell Chase project that was talked about. And following that legislation, following that project, it's very exciting to see. And when we were talking earlier, that's the first project of that kind that you're seeing moving forward. It's not the first P3 in Louisiana by any means. What we have tool-wise is you've got several things. You've got the ability to enter into what's called cooperative endeavor agreements. There's a lot of flexibility within cooperative endeavor agreements so long as they are within the confines of the Louisiana Constitution. Primarily in Louisiana, you cannot have an impermissible donation of public funds. So the public just can't come to you, understandably, and say, here's $1 million. That's where I was talking earlier about the 2006 Louisiana Supreme Court case. In economic development circles, we call that the Cabela case. If you drive in between here and Baton Rouge, off the exit, there's that big Cabela's, and some taxpayers sued the state of Louisiana, that Industrial Development Board, because they felt that was an impermissible use of public funds. They basically were giving that to the developer. The Supreme Court came back and said, no, it's not a donation. It's not an impermissible donation because the public is receiving equivalent or greater value in return, and that board made that determination. So we can do a lot within the CEA world on that. The public side can do a lot too, and we're seeing this more and more because they don't have cash and they're not getting appropriations to participate perhaps at the level that they want from available money. They are putting assets into projects. Two in particular that I can talk about is the Port of New Orleans in 2009 began doing this with what's now called the Mega Plastics District along the Industrial Canal Corridor, which is about a 90-acre development that has yielded over 48,000 net new containers to the Port of New Orleans. So it checks off the Cabela's test, right? But what did the port do? The port used what's called the Industrial Inducement Statute, and transferred the property, the real estate property itself, to the developer. And in doing that, allowed them to have security to leverage up traditional financing and put their own equity into the game to make the project work. The port didn't have the money to build what's now going to be over 1 million square foot of facility space for packaging of this petrochemical downstream product that's now getting exported out of here. They didn't have the money to do it. So they needed the private sector to do that, and they used the one true asset that they had, which was the real estate. Another example of it is, while by legal definition doesn't fit into the DOTD P3 legislation, academically it was a P3, or is a P3, is the ferry project where we saw Transdev, our local operator of our public transportation services here, in essence take over the DOTD's assets, put on a user fee for usage of the ferries, and now triggering investment by that private entity in new ferry terminals and new ferries. And that's kind of a project that we've seen here that is enabled not by, again, definitional P3 legislation in the state of Louisiana, but other statutory components that relate to cooperative endeavor agreements in that instance with another local, through the local services law, another local agency who could enter into an operating agreement. So I would say this, and this is, I think, an important thing, particularly if I think Bobby Landry left, but dealing with the port on that project, the prior project I talked about, but in general having conversations with governmental agencies. In order to be a successful P3 governmental agency, you've got to be creative. You've got to be willing to be creative. You've got to look at all the opportunities that you have at your disposal and commit your team to not ask the question, where in the law does it say we can do this? But ask the question, is there something in the law that prohibits us from doing this? It's a very important difference in questions that I'm happy to report that in the last 10 years that I've been doing this, I've seen a significant paradigm shift in how those questions are being asked. And that's a good thing. That's a positive. But we need to keep pushing that. Of course, I want to do that because it helps my private side clients a lot of times. But it really is what makes these projects happen within the realm of the law. Again, it's not promoting to do something that's not permitted, but it's looking at the law in terms of what we can do. So that's a long-winded way of talking about a very boring topic, but.
Yeah, I'm not going to try and add anything to that. Although I did read that there's a connection between P3 and the 10th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Maybe we can talk about that later. I mean, I think it goes that enabling legislation, is critical. Without that, ultimately, a project cannot happen. But it's interesting what Chris is saying about the paradigm shift. Exactly that point, I ran into some of the early P3s in where the enabling legislation didn't specifically permit the agency to do something. And in one case, it caused a 2-year delay as local regulations and legislation had to be changed, and the project went sideways, and the project nearly died, and it sort of all came together ultimately again. So I think that's critical. And secondly, also the point that Chris made in terms of the way people really need to look at it, I think a lot of it goes back to the fact that P3s are not, it's not really part of the DNA, as in many other jurisdictions, even just if we look at Canada, which, by population is, I don't know, is it 10 or 15 times smaller? But our P3 market by dollar value, I think 2 years ago at least, was roughly the same. And so I think with enabling legislation, with more and more people doing it, looking at the projects, I think this will add, to this cultural change that Chris is talking about.
Well, I can talk about the exciting world of EB5 legislation. There's been quite a bit of drama the last couple of years because the Regional Center program is a pilot program. And so it sunsets every now and then, and so it has to be reauthorized by Congress. And in the last couple of years, there's been a movement to reform the program, to make it better, to tighten the TEA rules, to keep the bad actors out. And that's come from some very high-profile public fraud in the EB5 program. So the hope is that with these reform changes, that we'll get better quality players coming in and keep the bad ones out. And I hope that that will certainly be the case. So the reform legislation, when it happens, and it is a matter of when, and today it looks like it might be the end of the year, but probably more likely by first quarter of 2018, we will have a longer term 5 or 6 year reauthorization with these reforms built in. I think the exciting thing about the new reform legislation from a P3 standpoint is that it would do a couple of things. One is it would incentivize certain kinds of projects. What kinds of projects? Projects that are in distressed urban, poor urban areas that have criteria that are key to new market tax credit criteria. And it would also incentivize projects in rural areas by giving visa set-asides to projects in rural and distressed urban areas, which are at a premium because of this very, very long wait for this precious commodity EB5 visa. The demand far, far exceeds the limited supply of 10,000 visas we have in EB5 a year. So allowing investors who invest in urban and rural areas to cut the queue and go directly to getting a green card is a true incentive. So public-private partnerships in rural and distressed urban areas might get that boost. I hope that'll happen. The other thing that could happen in reform legislation is an incentive not based on visa set-asides, but based on price for projects that are manufacturing or infrastructure. Manufacturing has a pretty clear definition. It has to involve production of some part of something made in the United States. Infrastructure definition has been evolving, and it's a little more loosey-goosey. Not loosey-goosey, but more, it's intangible. It's more difficult to define. But the one element that seems to be in all of the drafts of legislation that propose a manufacturing incentive, or rather an infrastructure incentive, involves a government contract, which, as I understand it, is a component of many, if not all, P3 projects. So if we have that pricing incentive for manufacturing and infrastructure projects, that might be yet another boost from a legislative standpoint that new EB5 legislation might give to P3 projects.
I'll continue a little on Chris's point about the paradigm shift, is that the history of the kind of a P3 market in the US, and as Jake pointed out, is much more than in some other countries, is, all started with toll roads and toll assets. There were the sale of the Indiana toll road, the Skyway in Chicago were big just sales of existing assets. And those were easy for investors to understand, because it's like, every time a car goes on the road, it pays a toll, it generates revenue. So all we're doing is forecasting what those revenues are going to be going to the future. But the market has really evolved. Like, now we're talking about P3s for campus development. The University of California system in one of their college campuses used a P3 project delivery method to build a lot of student housing as well as instructional space. Kansas University did the same thing. We're also talking about transit projects, water and wastewater projects. And so the project scope is expanding. So I oftentimes in Louisiana, you hear that Louisiana is not a toll state. Well, that may very well be, but that should not be the hindrance or prohibitive factor when it comes to P3 as a project delivery. Like, I think that any project that you may have as a decision maker or otherwise is that you just evaluate, hey, is it beneficial to do this with the traditional financing and delivery methods, or should I look at P3? Can P3 make this project happen when otherwise it wouldn't? And so again, like we shouldn't just talk about it in the context of transportation and infrastructure, although it's an important discussion, which kind of expand the mindset to look at other municipal and not even municipal necessarily, but other projects where government and private sector can team up.
Thank you very much. We've only got a few minutes left. For me, my transition from economic development to economic recovery from disaster began with Hurricane Katrina. And it's very gratifying to know that one of the first things that we were asked to do with this new center is to document a best practice in P3 for resilience or recovery. And we have one right here in New Orleans. It's University Medical Center. Their emergency room is incredible. If you've not seen it, please go take a look at it. It's, I believe, 20 feet above grade level, has triple redundancy, and all of its equipment has enough food and water to house 100 people for something on the order of a month. It's really, and it's a public-private partnership because University Medical Center is the state of Louisiana and Children's Hospital Foundation. And actually, that was presented as a best practice and was named the best practice case study that was presented at a recent meeting of the P3 groups in Hong Kong. So that's again another great thing that we don't even recognize that we're doing here in Louisiana. We are doing P3s. And we're doing a pretty good job with that. We just have to do more. So with that, I'll open it up for questions. Any questions? Anyone? Okay, one right here. Sorry, Caitlin.
Exercise fix for the day. Who had the question?
David Baxter. When you talk about PPPs, you're also talking about innovation, and there are a lot of new innovative funds that are now emerging that can be used for PPPs, and some that I've come across are impact funds. The other is diaspora funds, which immigrant communities are looking at, putting their money that they've made elsewhere, and then pension funds are getting very, very focused on funding large PPP projects. I was just wondering if any of the panel participants had any experience with any of these type of funds. And I'll just repeat, it's the impact funds, diaspora funds, and pension funds.
Definitely on the pension fund side is that, CalPERS, especially in California, has been kind of on the forefront of infrastructure investment, and what they would come as an equity investor. They typically, municipal bond is not as attractive for them because the municipal bond in today's market, in a long-term bond, rate of return can be 3% or lower in some cases. So for a pension fund that's trying to earn 7% or higher in their investments, that return is not attractive in and itself. However, if they can come in an equity investor and get that 7 to 10% return on their investment, then they'll be more attracted. Now, the flip side of it is that why would a municipality, for example, to pay that higher return? Well, it's because the equity is more patient investors, and it may allow projects to happen that otherwise wouldn't.
Hey, good afternoon. Ian Voparel with Shell. I really appreciate the session. It's very interesting. And I wanted to be very provincial in my question. There are a lot of national economies that flow through Louisiana that are of tremendous importance both to the private and public sectors. Many of them are challenged by this thing here called coastal change. And so I'm wondering if any of you have any thoughts what you would like to see in the due diligence to allow 3P kinds of finance and funding mechanisms to be applicable towards the coastal protection projects that the state and a couple of private sector entities are proposing.
Just issued a request for qualifications for entities to provide advisory services dealing with alternative methods of injecting private capital into the projects that they're undertaking in coastal restoration and protection. And that included public-private partnerships. They wanted firms to come in and advise them on public-private partnerships, how to structure them. So the CPRA is actively looking at that right now, and that's a great thing because, again, that goes back to resilience. There is, would you drive your car down the street, especially in New Orleans, without having an insurance policy on it? Yet we have our entire economies at stake that we really don't have insured because we haven't taken those steps to become more resilient. So yes, the answer is yes, they are looking at that. Any other questions? Okay, we have another one.
I'm from Haiti, and so I'm very glad to hear some of those discussions that you guys are having in terms of infrastructure financing. This is one of the biggest need we have there, and this is like opening my eyes a lot. So I'm wondering, are you guys ever done any outside of the country financing? If some of these opportunities were backed by the World Bank or International Development Bank, or if the government would be willing to sort of, there's a gentleman that talked about the transfer of property or any other kind of leveraging that could happen in terms of insurance or assurance in terms of those financing.
I haven't, but there's I think a great example to your question that I have experienced, and I'll just share it quickly with you. But in Panama, they've got this this P3 kind of like utopian little area called Panama Pacifico, and it's a model that I think that I've seen and taken away, and really there's several places here in New Orleans. I wish we would take that model and implement it. But I don't have the experience of actually doing a project outside of the country. But I would suggest look at that project as a good model.
I've worked on P3 deals in Africa quite a bit. And at the end of the day, you look at the same building blocks in a project, P3, the financing commercial structure is the same for a project anywhere. I don't know about Haiti in particular, but certainly for cross-border projects, whether in emerging markets or in developed markets, we look at all of the sources of capital out there. I mean, so we could tap the export credit agencies, we could tap development financing institutions, et cetera, and quite simply cross-border sources of financing. In our case, in particular as well, one of the things in Siemens that we're doing on the industrial side of the business, in conjunction with Siemens Financial Services, is the concept of performance contracting. And so we could, if it's our technology in a project, and we are obviously best able to verify and guarantee the operation, the technology, the output of that piece of equipment over time, it is those savings that we generate from putting new equipment in that could pay for the project. So there's all kinds of things sort of around that theme that is happening as well. As to Haiti specifically, I don't have a view as to which sources of financing is actually open to Haiti and which sources of financing one would approach. Antti, do you have a view on that?
I mean, it goes back to you mentioned World Bank, and you have to just have the kind of legal structure in place and the appropriate backing, and and I'm sure that there's always if there's a will and there's a project, there's usually a way to get done if the funding is found as well from sources like that.
I'll just say that EB5 is limited to projects in the U.S. and territories, so EB5 unfortunately couldn't be a part of that.
I have a question. Thank you all for coming today. Wonderful comments and input. I'm actually encouraged by the trend line. I think we do need to bring a lot of this to Louisiana. Specifically to EB5 again, I've seen some data that certainly our state has been an underperforming state in terms of EB5 participation. You look at southern partners like Texas, Oklahoma, Florida, they seem to be in the game more than our state. Of course, that's not unique to EB5. Things like SBIR grants for innovation have a similar trend line. But what do you attribute to that, if anything, in your work nationally? And I guess what could we do more to empower the EB5 side of the PPP projects here? First part. Second part, globally, I understand China may be oversubscribed, and so what countries do you look to for the wealth investment, foreign investment into U.S. projects?
Yeah, I guess I'll start with the second first. So China is slowing down dramatically. So it is going to be difficult without visa reform for EB5, or more broadly, to capitalize large projects involving EB5. So I would say it's going to be very, very hard to fill up a project that's going to require 50 and upwards million in EB5 in the coming years. But I was heartened to hear that there are opportunities for smaller P3 projects in Louisiana and elsewhere, and I think those would be great opportunities. Start small, start conservative, structure it right, get it sound at the outset, and experiment and have some successes. And I think smaller projects are a good way to get a foothold that way. The markets that are emerging are in South America, Brazil primarily down there, Vietnam, South Korea has traditionally always been strong, and it will continue to be, it looks like. Hong Kong, Taiwan, India is emerging as a huge secondary market. Two of my partners just got back from Mumbai. The same partners are today in Abu Dhabi. So Middle East. So ranking those, I would say India, Vietnam, Brazil, Middle East. And then hopefully China will come back to allow larger projects. In terms of why Louisiana was in there early. My firm represented, I think, the first or one of the first regional centers to span more than one state, and the rationale was Katrina. It was to help in recovery post Katrina. As to why it hasn't really caught fire here, not really sure, quite honestly. I think all it takes is one or two successes, and that sort of, gives it the momentum and the buzz and the awareness in the market. Certainly, everything I've heard here makes me very excited for the opportunities here because there's a need and there's the support, the public support. I think that, I don't know, I mean, I think that, a conversation coming together, how we can use more P3, EB5 being a part of that, I think a conversation like that might be worth having, Caitlin. Yeah, would be very, very happy to be a part of that.
Thank you. I think we're out of time, and I had one last thing on the agenda. I've been debating about whether or not to take the time to do this, but you've waited this long. You might as well hear it. I asked each one of the panelists to tell the audience something surprising about them, something that you might not know. It's always good to end on a light note, right? And I'll start with mine. I have a 30-inch inseam. My track coach used to call me Stump because I have such short legs. But for some unknown reason, I'm left-handed, but I could kick like a bandit with my right foot. And for years, I held the record for the longest field goal in Louisiana high school. I went to a tiny school, and I had scholarship offers from major universities. And the second to last game my senior year, one of my teammates inadvertently fell on a tackle, a kickoff tackle, and tore my knee completely up. So that's why I'm not, in the NFL Hall of Fame right now.
Well, mine is not nearly as good as yours, and I don't know why I'm batting second here, but one of the things that you may or may not know about me, I have the opportunity to represent the New Orleans Saints, which that in of itself is cool. But in 2014, I had a very dubious honor of debating our future Hall of Fame quarterback, Drew Brees, during a legislative session on an issue that he was in support of the players and I was in support of the owners, which drew a lot of media attention, so much so that my mom called me and told me, leave Drew Brees alone. He needs to focus on winning football games. So.
Mine has nothing really to do with me, but it is a big inspiration for me. About 17, 18 years ago, I think, I was in the presence of Nelson Mandela. And, it's one of those just very special things that happen in your life. And I was actually at this event on invitation from one of my closest friends, who was Nelson Mandela's one of Nelson Mandela's bodyguards when he first got released from jail. So, what can I say? Say no more. That's it.
I'm in the presence of greatness once removed. I am a Meisner-trained actress. I guess that's the fun fact about me. I went through 2 years of training, and I've been in student films, nothing that you can find on YouTube, so don't even try. So that's my little fun fact.
And my fun fact, if you couldn't tell from the accent, I'm not originally from Louisiana, but prior to becoming a U.S. citizen, I had to serve in the Finnish military and became proficient in Morse code.
And became a second lieutenant in 1 year. So,
We do. Great. I just want to say one last thank you to the panel. You all were marvelous. We learned so much today about financing and structuring P3s. So please help me once more in thanking our panelists and our moderator.